So welcome dear ones. Welcome to Ray of God. Ray seeks to share feminine spiritual wisdom to help realize God in all ways and to align with justice, truth and beauty. The energetic state of the feminine is our guiding principle and holds our intention. And we believe that all genders hold the feminine and masculine within themselves. And while we are women-led and women-centered, we welcome and encourage all genders to join us in helping to create safer, more inclusive spaces. So I'm delighted to be continuing with our Ray Read sessions, a monthly book chat with a fabulous cohort of authors. And our book highlight this month is The Hebrew Priestess, Ancient and New Visions of Jewish Women's Spiritual Leadership with Jill Hammer. Absolutely delighted to welcome Jill back. I know many of you will remember her from our Rayfest sessions that she's joined, and we're having a one-to-one chat with her today. So I just want to read a little bit of the blurb for the book before we begin. So it has been barely 40 years since rabbinical seminaries began ordaining women as rabbis. But women have played a role in Jewish religious leadership from the days of the Bible and even before. Miriam the Prophetess and Deborah the Judge are just the two most prominent of these women, most of whose names are lost to history. The Hebrew Priestess tells the stories of these women, often reading between the lines of the Bible and Talmud to rediscover the women that rabbinic editors tried to erase. It weaves together a careful examination of historical antecedents of these new priestesses, along with the personal experiences of women who embarked on this new path of Jewish priestesshood. It's a delicious combination of different ways of dipping into this book, and we will get into that, but I would just like to welcome Jill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor and a pleasure, and always wonderful to talk to you.
So Jill, I got this book the very first year that we did Rayfest, and I had been dipping in and out of it. And then this year I really kind of sat down and spent time going through each modality, so each of the priestesses. And I wrote a review about it on my Instagram, but I just wanted to say, I've never come across something that weaves her story and the academic rigorous references to sacred text sources, but also providing a very nuanced and gentle way of perhaps rethinking what the text has said. And so for each of the priestess modes, we have this at the beginning, and then you share a guided meditation that readers can work through. And there's also guidance on how one can work through these guided meditations. And then also practical practices that we can incorporate. And I always say this, yeah, I'm doing better. I've not tabbed nearly every page. I have quite enough references, but there are so many of these practices that are really, regardless of which spiritual tradition you may come from, and even if you don't come from one, they're so accessible and so exciting. Like for each one, I was just like, oh, I want to do this now. I want to sit and deepen in this. So before I get into all of my excitement, perhaps we could open with, I had a note here that just the opening for your introduction. I wanted to just read the dream that you start with and then ask you to share how this book came into being. So this is from the introduction, and Jill says, "Let me begin with a dream. There is a vast temple divided in two. One half is occupied by priests and the other by priestesses. There are high stone walls. The temple is under siege. The high priestess awakens at night, gathers her handmaidens, and goes to the priest's dwelling. She contacts the high priest. She is looking for a lost sacred object. The high priestess and the other men and women enter the underground tunnels beneath the temple. The group arrives at an inner chamber. They wait. They are expecting a communication. I just got goosebumps reading that again. So that is, you're sharing your dream as the opening to this book. And I'd just like to, hand it over to you, what that means to you and how this came into being. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I got some chills myself hearing that dream again. It was a long time ago now that I had it, but it was so striking. One of my own spiritual commitments, priestess commitments, is that I do my best to be guided by my dreams. And there were many powerful dreams in the years that I was gestating, and then eventually helping to give birth to Kohenet and the associated work and movements and ritual practices. And that particular dream was so powerful because of its sense of anticipation, right? That something was about to happen, right? And that everyone in this temple and this fortress knew that something was about to happen. And the question was how we were going to meet that something. And when I look back on the last 18 years, it's probably been 21 years or so since I had that dream, and a number of years, I don't know how many, 10, 12 since I wrote the book. And what was clear to me at that time was that I was waiting for something, that there had been a considerable feminist surge, in terms of new voices in spiritual life, or women's voices, non-binary voices in spiritual life. And yet we were still kind of having the same conversation, right? That had certain boundaries on it that had been set by these spiritual traditions, and that didn't allow one to stray too far, right, from the structures that had already been created. And I was feeling so frustrated by that. And I think that dream, which has a theme that's common to my dreams, which is the process of going underground, at the process of getting kind of below the structures, right, and into the tunnels beneath, right? That's not an uncommon image in my dreams. It comes up a lot. And for me, what that means is that in order to really begin to experience what our spiritual path and work is, we have to make some effort to get beneath the structures that we've been handed. And that is really what a lot of my work tries to do, right? Is not to sort of burn down those structures, but to find out, like, how did this get here? And how does it serve us, and how does it not serve us, right? And what else might we discover beneath these walls, right? That we might want to bring out into the light of day. So that's what that dream means to me still. And it and other dreams, helped birth some of the work that I do with groups of folks who are interested in the Hebrew Priestess tabs.
Oh, thank you. And you actually take us seamlessly into the next quote that I wanted to read out as well. I think I shared this on the Ray social media. I can't remember now which quotes I shared where, because there were so many. This one, like you say, we're not trying to burn anything down. It's already happening. And so you say this in the introduction again on page 13. For many of us, the old temple of Western religion is burning. And I'd say West and East, global religion is burning. It cannot keep its systems of thought intact. We are seeking a new temple, one that links our inherited traditions with our forgotten ancestors, symbolized in the dream by the totem poles. This was following another dream that you'd shared. Within the new temple, we are piecing together treasures that were lost and broken, lives of the priestesses, and stories of the sacred feminine. We will pass on these treasures to our children, not in exactly the same form as they existed in antiquity, but transformed by our experience. And it's just so hopeful, those lines, because it is acknowledging the truth of what we are surrounded by. And that is devastation, really, on so many different levels. And before we can go through change or any type of transformation, we must first acknowledge, what are we standing in? You know, what has happened? And I also want to come back to something just earlier in the introduction, which really struck me, which is something I really struggle with. And you said that, you know, when you were in rabbinical school, you said, I was deeply unsettled to see brilliant women and men spending huge amounts of time trying to prove legally and ethically that women were entitled to basic spiritual and communal rights. The onus seemed to be on women and their supporters to prove their point against, you know, all the systems that we have. And sometimes that's where I get really, I feel stuck sometimes in these conversations where we shouldn't have to prove that women and children have as much soul or right to stand in front of the Creator. We're already here standing in front of creation. So it's like, why do we have to prove that we're breathing before we can? And that conversation, that even the request for the proof is so offensive to all of creation. And yet I know so many people and organizations and movements that kind of get stuck in this. And I think there is a growing acknowledgement that these are the wrong questions that first of all, it shouldn't be a question, let alone even trying to attempt to answer something so ridiculous. And so this acknowledgement that, you know, we're in this broken temple and we need a new temple. And this also really important acknowledgement of what has come before, and that we draw upon what has come before, but we look at it with fresh eyes. And that is something that we should be doing at all times. And so I guess, you know, we can talk then more about your work and Cohort Institute that came out of all of this that you are doing, and you're creating a new system that is showing a different way that we can walk these paths of spirit with support from everyone around us. And could you share more about that, please?
Sure, of course. So, you know, Taya and I, Taya Shear, the co-founder of Cohort, and I, you know, we're really coming to this work from different angles. Like, I had been really steeping in the rabbinic tradition, sort of in, you know, very intense study of Jewish civilization. And she had actually been in Brazil studying priestesses in different traditions. And both of us had come to the same conclusion, which is that there was, or at least could be, like a Jewish priestessing tradition. And that it was sitting there in plain sight, right? And no one had ever called it that. And so some of the work that we wanted to do was to make visible what had been invisible. And there were a lot of different components to that. To look at, for example, right, the prophetess Miriam with her frame drum. Right? This is an image of priestesses all over the ancient Near East, right? You know, in Greece and Egypt, right, in so many different places, right? You see, you know, groups of women with frame drums, right? And those are priestesses. And, you know, here is a group of women with frame drums at a sacred occasion in ancient Israel, right? Only no one is calling them priestesses, but Miriam is the sister of the high priest. Interesting. So we took examples like that and we said, look, they're sitting here, right? We didn't call them that. We were told not to call them that, you know, that this is different from all other cultures in the ancient Near East, right? We don't have priestesses. But if you begin looking, you can see that they're there. You know, they may be there in a more veiled way, right? But they're there. And, you know, you can trace that through Jewish history. I mean, some of this for me is a fixing of, is a repair of, you know, a Jewish history that I received that was basically devoid of women's contributions, except for a couple of extraordinary women who would appear in the history books, right? But not very many. You know, for example, some of our students and colleagues that have kind of come along for the Cohort ride are studying women in ancient Europe, women in Eastern Europe who are tending graveyards and who are taking care of the spirits of the ancestors, right? And who have a really important spiritual role in the community in doing that. women in Yemen who are wailing women who help people to grieve, right? And that's important spiritual work that they're doing and is passed down from one generation to the other, along with midwifery. Women in Sephardic Jewish women in Greece who and elsewhere who are preserving traditions of healing, right, and doing spiritual healing work. And all these things, traditionally in Jewish in the study of Jewish civilization are called kind of folk magic, and they're peripheral, right? And the things that are central, right, are things that men did, like study Talmud, right, or mostly men did, right? Some women got to do it, mostly men did it. And so one thing that we figured out very quickly, as we were building Kohenet and thinking about what spiritual tradition do we want to train our students in, was to shift the frame, was to move the lens, right? To say the lens doesn't have to be where it is, where, these things are the center and these other things are, are fringe and peripheral. And if you're interested in them, okay, fine, but, it's not important. And to realize that those things were deeply important to the community and are deeply important. And those traditions are just as important to understand who we are, right, as, right, any tradition of tech scholars or, or anything else that has been at the center of the lens until now. And that helped us to think about what are the skills that we would like our students to have, right? We wanted to create transformative ritualists, right? We wanted to be in the tradition of these spirit workers who are connecting to the ancestors, who are creating healing ritual, right? We wanted to be in that lineage. And this really came out of for me, a kind of simple insight that didn't happen to me for a long time, which was, this can be my lineage, right? The lineage of rabbis, right, which dates back to the, at least the 2nd century CE, right? The lineage of rabbis is not the only lineage that I come from, right? And once I could say that, my place of empowerment became very different. Because instead of being a kind of, beggar at the door saying, can I come in? It really became, this belongs to me, right? I am arising from this tradition, and I don't have to feel that I'm a guest in this house, right? This is my house. And that consciousness, I think, is one of the most important things that we have transmitted to our participants and students, is the sense of home, right, in our spiritual lives.
Oh, it's beautiful. Sense of home. That really resonates. And one thing I was struck by, again, it's just the sacred in the everyday, in every moment. And in one sense, we have these 13 models of spiritual leadership, 13 different types of priestesses, and yet everything that they do is so intrinsic to day-to-day life, to living, all the stages that the human goes through from birth through to death. And then it's this sense of, what is sacred? Well, it's making every moment, it's just to make it holy. And it's the way that we approach this. And I was having a conversation with my aunt a few weeks ago. Her father had passed away, and we were talking about that we've lost ways to hold grief. And and you talk about the different stages, in the Jewish tradition and the Islamic. We have the 3 days of immediate mourning, and then we have the 40-day kind of remembrance, and then every year remembering on the death date. But we were talking about, my aunt and I, about how we've lost even the way to do those 3 days, because everybody's kind of like wanting to just get back. I mean, maybe it's becoming a bit British about it, and the stiff upper lip. You just kind of deal with it. And then everybody must go back to work because life goes on. But we've forgotten the essence of how holy and sacred it is that we do grieve, that it is a responsibility that we carry to have that time to hold the soul, but also to hold ourselves and our connection to the soul, and the importance of that family time. And I think that, especially in my family, we've kind of lost the essence of it, and it becomes more about the doing and the serving and the preparing, and less about the sitting and telling the stories and remembering, oh, do you remember, you know, when they did this? Well, you weren't there, this is what happened. And so other people in the family are able to connect these moments with the soul that has passed, and it is an honoring of that process. And so that was really coming through for me, you know, and not just with you know, the wailing women and the people that hold the grief, but through all these modalities that we've almost put what is something sacred up on a pedestal, but then we're not engaging with it and realizing that it is in every moment of our day-to-day that we should be connecting to that. And, you know, all the different, you know, the weavers and the sacred hole spaces, and, you know, the ones who bring you over the threshold. And it's so interesting. And there's so many, obviously, this is the Abrahamic tradition. There are so many, you know, ways that this touches upon the different religions. But when you were talking about the drumming, and when I was reading about it in the book, immediately I was thinking about when Prophet Muhammad came back to Mecca, and the women were on the rooftops with the frame drums, and they were singing a song to welcome him to the city. And I was reading this, and I was thinking, this is what they were doing, you know. And how were they chosen? You know, were they particular women, you know, of the community? And how were they taught to do that? And how were these songs passed down? You know, and who initiated that? Who said that, you know, this is happening, and the women will, you know, somebody led, you know, an elder woman led these women to the rooftops and said, this is what we do. This is what we've been, you know, we've been learning, and now this is an opportunity to share it with the community. And like you said, there, you know, these figures are, we see them throughout our traditions, but we don't connect them in the same way. And I had something here that I had highlighted as signs, which was actually in chapter 6, which is the witch priestess, which just kind of made me laugh because it made me rethink a lot of what I've been taught. So it says here that the Bible bans witchcraft and specific magical practices, including divination, even though high priests divine using the breastplate, interpreting of signs, even though the prophets interpret signs, and communication with spirits, although numerous biblical characters communicate with angels. This made me laugh for a moment, that even in my, you know, it's so many traditions, this is kind of like, oh, it's frowned upon. Well, unless a man's doing it, then it's holy. You know, oh no, you can't be looking at signs in the cosmos unless a man's doing it, you know, unless an astrologer is doing it and it's seen as scientific, and, you know, it correlates to all of this. And so I read this and I kind of highlighted it, and I just kind of laughed for a little while, thinking, recognizing within myself how even I, through my upbringing, have kind of separated, you know, one's kind of witchcraft and one is holy and sacred. And now that distinction is kind of blurring, and it's all coming to that, well, actually, it depends on who's telling the story and how they're sharing it. So yeah, anything you want to add to that?
You know, I think that for me, this is really a core insight. A lot of anthropologists, you know, used to say, oh, there's ritual and there's magic, right? And then at some point they realized that ritual and magic actually work exactly the same way, right? And what's different, right, is that one of them is being done communally within an authority, you know, within a power structure, right? And the other one, right, is being done often privately, right, outside that power structure. But otherwise, often they're indistinguishable, right? And once you kind of remove the frame that we are, you know, that we are offered, right, that we're given, which is, oh, this is sacred, right, and this is borderline dangerous, interesting, exotic, problematic, right? And then you know, and then when that distinction begins to blur, right, then you understand the political underpinnings of that distinction, right, which is these are the people that you should trust with your relationship to spirit. And these are the people that everybody goes to, but that you shouldn't trust, right? Because there's something, right? There's something not, you know, not authorized happening here. And once you notice that, then you can actually begin to recalibrate, right, your sense of where spiritual power is. right? And we still get to make choices, right? We still get to say, right, I want to do this kind of ritual, not that kind of ritual. Like we still get to do that, right? But we're not being imposed on, right, by, you know, a structure that actually has reasons why it doesn't want us to pay attention to those people, right? It has economic reasons, right? It has reasons of authority, right? It may have reasons of theology, right? But there is an agenda that says, right, these are the people you can trust, right? These are the rituals that you can go to for strength and support, right? And this stuff, right, is problematic. I mean, there's this scene that I teach a lot in the book of Samuel, where the king is sort of King Saul is just miserable because God won't talk to him, right? His prophet won't talk to him, and so in desperation, he goes to a medium, right? He goes to a witch, right, whose work is forbidden, and he disguises himself and he asks her for help. And she's actually one of the last people who's kind to him in his entire life. And what you can kind of see there is that even though he's the person who passed the law, right, he still understands that there is some power here. So I think it's important for, if we're, you know, as we're doing, you know, spiritual history that relates to women and relates to gender, that we be, you know, we be a little bit less obliging, right, toward the, you know, toward the line that we've been handed about, you know, who, right, who is legitimate and who is not.
I love that. And I think what I'm finding more and more is sometimes maybe instead of projecting outward, you know, like, why have you made me think this way, is actually reflecting upon myself on, oh, how much I've taken on myself, you know, how much, even though I think I'm fighting against the patriarchy, so much of it has almost, you know, kind of become my DNA because that was the air that I was breathing. And so unpacking that within myself has become really important. And I can't find the reference, so correct me if I paraphrase wrong, but I loved where you talk about your wife and this, that she was, you know, her father was telling her that, you know, you come from a long line, like 14 generations of rabbis, and how she was feeling that pressure and that burden. And then you kind of turned around and said to her, but you come from 14 generations of women. And I was like, wow, like, it sounds so, like, ridiculously simple, and yet so powerful, because it's where we place our focus. And if we put our focus on the thing that isn't actually helpful to us, but might have been helpful for the men beforehand, but isn't helpful to us as women, we remember that the men come from the women, and the men were with the women, you know, and the men couldn't have done the work without the women. And actually then, if they're the men with the rabbis, were the women not the priestesses, side by side, and we also come from then. And then we can look at our lineage and we can then connect to that. Yes. It was such a powerful part of the book, and I just had to sit back for a little while and just go, okay, let me think about my lineage.
Yeah, that was a big moment. That was a big moment for us, you know, just sort of burst out, you know, Shoshana, you come from 14 generations of women, of course, many more than that. Right, and again, it's like, it's about where we put the lens, you know, it's about, you know, what, that we get to claim our own ancestry, where we get to say, right, how we want to understand, right, the you know, the legacy that we, you know, that we are part of. No, absolutely. I think it's so important and so powerful, and it's precisely because, you know, we've been trained to think about, you know, this is our spiritual lineage, and, you know, it rarely includes women, and, you know, we're supposed to kind of imagine that we're there kind of around the fringes, but that's not exactly the important part. You know, we don't have to buy that. You know, and it's actually better for everyone when we don't, because there's so much richness that is excluded by that lens, right? There's so much, you know, power that is excluded by that, right? There's many spiritual practices, right? There's you know, like in my tradition, you know, there's like amazing queer poets. There's, you know, there's all kinds of riches, right? It's not just, you know, you have to let us in because that's fair. I mean, that's true, but it's also so much more generous. You know, there's so much more to abundance, right? When we're not, you know, we're not kind of restricting our perception in that way. you know, I remember particularly noticing years ago the way that Jewish feminists would recoil from the word goddess. You know, they would talk about the divine feminine, and they would talk about, you know, they would use all kinds of God, she, they would use all kinds of words, but they wouldn't use that word. That word was completely off limits. And because that was, you know, somehow going to be beyond the pale, you know, a betrayal of, you know, of their spiritual commitments. And I would watch them spend, you know, 5 philosophical points explaining why they wouldn't use that word. And then I was like, well, let's try it and see what happens. And actually the sky didn't fall. Right? And, you know, no, you know, the spiritual tradition didn't fall apart. It was fine. And now it's I translated a prayer book for my community here in New York, and the word appears in our prayer book. And, you know, it didn't, you know, nobody got struck with lightning. And, you know, it's just another window on the divine.
Yeah, I love that. The sky didn't fall down in that moment. You weren't struck by lightning for daring. And you know, I've come across that in my circles, not just Muslim, but kind of interspiritual circles. That's that same kind of, oh, you know, we'll be daring with lots of different things, but when it comes to saying she, that's oh no, that's just too much. And you talk about this as well in chapter 2, the brief history, on page 43. And I love the way that you kind of wove this in. So I'll try and truncate this big paragraph that I'd highlighted. And he said, the identification of goddess with world can have a negative effect of identifying women with primal nature, while men become identified with civilization and power. This either has the effect of infantilizing women and giving men control of society, or of idealizing women and demonizing men. It is perhaps better for modern mystics to assert that all faces of God are embodied in the world, and all faces of the world are embodied in God. It isn't that goddess, she, is nature, and God, he, is transcendent, not nature. The experience of immanence and the experience of transcendence are both unpredictable and personal, and both can appear as masculine or feminine, or both, or neither. And I think I felt this with the work that we've done with Ray, is that, you know, it's women-centered and women-led, and I use she for the divine because that's been a very personal journey for myself. But it's also about explaining that it's not just this, it's not just, you know, goddess, she, and that's it. There's no space for everything else, because everything emerges, you know, like we say, from the womb of God, and that is all of creation, gendered or not gendered. And so the danger that we can then come into, where we start applying our personality, our egos, you know, so that we can have the toxic feminine and the toxic masculine, and then we start projecting that onto our conception of like the male God and the female God. And I think that can get really, really messy, where we start to think, well, okay, well then the feminine is just like, you know, really toxic, and so I don't want to connect to the goddess because that's really difficult for me. And I think so much of the work is kind of untangling why we have these associations, where on the whole we don't really project toxic masculinity onto God. You know, when we think of you know, the God wherever it may be. And something I found quite interesting recently is I realized that sometimes when people even use they to refer to God, he and they are more acceptable than she. So never mind the uproar that happens when you dare to say she against he. But now it's almost like, oh, well, actually, you know, they as God, because God is, you know, majestic, and the royal we. So they makes Shakespearean sense. So we'll have they, but we still can't have she. That's still too much too controversial. And you say at the end of this paragraph that it is also important to acknowledge that gender categories extend beyond male and female, and God can be seen as transgender and without gender as well. And I thought that was again, I feel like most people can be very easy to say that God is without gender, but if you dare to say that God can be seen as transgender, because that's so loaded, and yet actually if you are able to sit and really unpack what that means, then are you really objecting to something, or are you saying, actually, oh yeah, I do agree with that, I just didn't see it in that way? And like you said, it's important where we place our lens and what we are looking at, you know, and also what we bring to the table. to be open enough to say, well, this is actually, God is in everything. You know, all faces of the world are embodied in God. Do we really believe that if we're not allowing for all these different expressions to be free within us as well?
Yeah. You know, last night I was just listening. I went to a poetry reading by three wonderful trans poets. One of them was my friend Dr. Joy Layden, and she has written a book about the Shekhinah, about the feminine divine presence in Jewish tradition, a book of poems spoken by the Shekhinah. And one of the things that she talks about in her introduction is that as a trans person, because when she was young, she felt so alienated from her body, she identified with God, because God also didn't have a body. And, you know, she felt sort of seen by God in a way that she didn't feel seen by people. And so some of her capacity to narrate these very moving poems narrated by divine presence are because of that, you know, that very powerful connection that she's always felt with God's, you know, perspective on the world. So I think that when we allow, you know, these, you know, more voices to speak, you know, we get new ways of seeing and being and imagining. You know, and it doesn't have to be limited to, as you said, no, well, this is the way to do it, right? And we're going to exclude these other ways. You know, we're going to exclude these other ways of seeing because they're confusing or they're different. You know, we don't have to do that. We can encompass it, just the way that good poetry encompasses many different images.
And God encompasses all also. That sometimes almost like we forget that, as you know, oh, God, we are asking God to accept us, we're not realizing that God accepts all. And you know, once again, time flies by. Friends in gallery, if you have any questions, if you'd like to ask on camera, or if you want to share something in chat, please do go ahead. I was going to ask you, Jill, to go through, like, kind of maybe just give us an overview of the priestess archetypes that you have.
Sure. You know, we did it this way because we didn't want to give anybody the impression that there was only one way to be a priestess or to do sacred work, you know, or priestess, some people say now. So the difference, we call them the netivot, the priestess paths. We do them in different orders, but I'll read them in the order that they appear in the book. The weaver, right, the sacred weaver, the one who brings elements together. The prophetess, right, the priestess of the voice of the sacred message. The shrine keeper, right, the one who tends sacred space. The witch, who is working with the elemental powers and the ancestral powers. The maiden priestesses, who in the biblical tradition are often the dancers and drummers. The mother priestesses, who are nurturers and community builders. The queen, we'd actually come to call her the guardian, the one who protects society and protects sacred space. The midwife, right, who helps to bring things into being. The wise woman, who's a healer, initiator, teacher. The mourning woman, who helps us process our grief. The seeker, who's the pilgrim, the one who's always discovering and wanting new things. The lover, who is priestess of intimacy, right, and of being alive and open to deep experience. And the fool, right, who is always turning things upside down when we finally get to where we think we know what's going on. The fool comes and shatters it all. So those are the 13. And one of our core assignments at the Kohenet Institute has been that we ask people to write an essay on 4 of them, 2 that they identify with, 1 that they're growing into, and 1 that's difficult for them. So they become a way of exploring our personality too.
Oh, I love that. I love the different ways. And that was one of my questions actually, was to ask, is it that can you move through different modalities during your life? Yes.
Yeah, in fact, I think that's more typical than not. You know, it's true of some people that they know which one of these they are, but most people move between at least a number of them. You know, have more than one or more than two that feel right at different moments, you know, in their day or in their life. And one of the things that we as a community sometimes say is that the spiritual practice of our community is you figure out which path is needed at that moment, and then you embody that path. Right? So it might be that what's needed is not even the one that's the most comfortable for you, but that's the one that is needed. And so that's the one that we invite to show up. So I don't think it's a question of choosing one or even choosing two or three. You know, we might have particular gifts, you know, in two or three, but really we probably are going to enter all or most of them throughout our lives.
Yeah, because as I was working through this, you know, I was thinking, oh, like this, I feel like I might be doing this, or this is something I'd like to try. And I was just thinking, well, I want to work with the practices. So I like what you said about these, you kind of like this assignment that you give to like 4 of them, and seeing which ones you resonate with, and maybe ones that you find difficult, because they're all aspects of ourselves anyway that we need to uncover and perhaps work with. And, you know, again, just to say again, so appreciative of the practices that have been offered by Taya Shear as well at the back. They're so, it's like in a sense, it's almost like a guided journal. You know, I really recommend that it's not just the information, the historical information and the textual information that you provide, but it is really a way of working with our soul to uncover ways that we might deal with certain challenges in our personal lives, in our work lives. And something that you kind of highlight in the book is that work is sacred. Everything that we do, we can bring the sacred into that. Nothing is really mundane if we look at it in that lens.
Yes, yes. And I think that insight is particularly suited to the way that many, you know, women have lived throughout history, which is that our lives are constantly interrupted by what's happening. You know, it's been very rare, you know, it happens, but it's been rare for women to be able to go off and, you know, meditate for 6 hours. You know, mostly we're doing our spiritual practice in the midst of a very busy life. Yeah, and that's sacred.
Mm. And I wanted to just kind of share this quote from the wise woman priestess, which really struck me. And you're talking about teachers, and you say, there is a psychic space in our minds for the elder, the master, the sage, or the wise woman. This is the person who challenges us to grow beyond where we currently are. Without these mentors and advisors, we have to struggle through our life lessons as orphans, without the benefit of the experiences of others. Wise women priestesses are mentors, storytellers, conflict mediators, and interpreters of tradition and law. They bring insight, prudence, and skill to any profession they may engage in, whether leader, healer, midwife, singer, or teacher, to name but a few. The wise woman can be experienced as a face of God. And I just thought that was so beautiful, and also really kind of embodied the way that Fatima and I kind of created Ray, which is a way to bring all these wonderful women that we want to sit with, that we want to, you know, talk to and learn from, but as a way of connecting to people that are our teachers, and not just, they might not have the mantle, the title of teacher, but the fact that they have navigated, you know, their journeys, their lives, and what they're in service to something, just automatically to me makes them a teacher and someone that can share what they have gone through and that we can all learn from. So I'm really so grateful to have had you be part of our Ray journey and for us to be connected with Kohenet. It's just been, you describe really beautifully, I haven't got that tabbed, I don't think, your experience at an interspiritual gathering where you say that, you know, and I feel the same way, interfaith can sometimes just be very lip service. You know, it's like interfaith can sometimes be very much about tea and samosa, and you don't get beyond that level. But when women come together in a spiritual way. All the baggage is left outside, and we are able to share our experiences, our sacred experiences, and know that they resonate with all the women present, because at the core, we're all doing the same thing. We're all turning in the same way to her face, the divine face. So I'm just so grateful for you to have written this and to have offered it, and to Taya share as well. Just really grateful for this beautiful book that I just can't really recommend highly enough. And I do hope to be working through all the modes, and hopefully maybe share some of my experiences with some of the guided meditations that you have done.
I so love that. And I just want to say that knowing that Ray of God and that you and your colleagues are doing this work makes us feel so spiritually accompanied and not lonely. So it's really a blessing to get to be in conversation with you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Jill. So as we come to a close, I was going to invite Jill to share a chant or a song. So the song that friends heard as they were coming in was was sent to me by Jill, and I'll let her explain where it came from, and she can lead us out with a prayer. Thank you so much, Jill.
Sure. So the song I'm going to offer is by Kohenet Joe Kent Katz. And the words are, Shekhinah spreads her wings, we come home to receive her love. Shekhinah spreads her wings, we come home, to receive her love, to receive her love, Shekhinah, spreads her wings, we come home, to receive her love, to receive her love, to receive her love.